The title of today's podcast is, Will You Accept God's Grandeur or Invest in the Ego's Grandiosity? For this podcast, I ask you to focus on the acceptance of your grandeur. You possess grandeur because you are part of God. This commentary will focus on Chapter 9, the acceptance of the atonement, Section 8, grandeur versus grandiosity, paragraphs 1 through 5, starting with paragraph 1. What does the word grandeur mean? The word grandeur is the quality of being grand, which is an old French word meaning great. In the course, what does the word grandeur refer to? In the course, grandeur refers to the great glory and magnificence of God Himself. Quote, grandeur is of God, and only of Him. If it is true that grandeur is of God and only of Him, what does grandeur have to do with you? Because you and all the other aspects of the Sonship are part of God, you and all your brothers share in God's grandeur. Because you are part of God, quote, grandeur is of God, therefore it is in you. How is your grandeur related to God's power and glory? The course saying that you have the grandeur of God is the same as saying you have all of God's unlimited power and glory. Quote, because your Creator creates only like Himself, you are like Him. You are part of Him who is all power and glory, and are therefore as unlimited as He is. Does Jesus have more grandeur than you have? You might think that the accomplishments of Jesus mean that He has more grandeur than other parts of the Sonship, but that is not true. Grandeur is shared equally by Jesus, by you, and by every other part of the Sonship. Grandeur is what kind of attribute? Grandeur is an unlimited divine attribute and not a partial attribute, but within perception, you have only a partial awareness of the unlimited nature of divine grandeur. Because you possess the grandeur that comes from God, does your grandeur make you special? No, because grandeur is shared equally by every part of the Sonship. Grandeur has nothing to do with the ego's false belief in specialness, which focuses on comparisons of differences and which focuses on judgments that some are more special and others are less special. Even if you have only a slight awareness of God's presence and His grandeur within you, you will have no interest in what? You will have no interest in listening to the ego. Quote, whenever you become aware of grandeur, however dimly, you abandon the ego automatically because in the presence of the grandeur of God, the meaninglessness of the ego becomes perfectly apparent. When you reject the ego and its meaninglessness, the ego will try to encourage you to invest in its thought system by offering you what? By offering you gifts. Whenever you become aware of grandeur, quote, even though the ego does not understand it, the ego believes that its enemy has struck and attempts to offer gifts to induce you to return to its protection. When the ego tries to gain your allegiance, the kind of gifts the ego offers you will always attempt to appeal to what? The ego's gifts will always attempt to appeal to your pride and to ideas of specialness that will inflate your opinion of yourself and deflate your opinion of others, making them less special than you are. Quote, self-inflation is the only offering the ego can make. In contrast to the grandeur possessed equally by every son of God, the ego offers you what? The ego offers you the self-inflation of grandiosity. The term grandiosity refers to an unrealistic sense of superiority in which someone believes himself to be better than others. Quote, the grandiosity of the ego is its alternative to the grandeur of God. What does grandeur offer you? Grandeur offers you equality with all your brothers, and grandeur reminds you that you are the Holy Son of God, the Christ, the true self. Quote, Christ is the self we share, uniting us with one another and with God as well. He is the thought which still abides within the mind that is his source. He abides unchanged forever in the mind of God. Grandiosity offers you what? Grandiosity offers you specialness, in which you misperceive yourself to be more special and thus superior to your brothers in your own mind. Quote, comparison must be an ego device, for love makes none. Specialness always makes comparisons. You have the two options of choosing the equality of grandeur or the specialness of grandiosity. But if you want to be happy, which will you choose? Only the choice for grandeur will express the truth and make you happy. Paragraph 2. The ego offers you what psychological extremes of self-perception? The ego offers you the two psychological extremes of superiority expressed by outer grandiosity or inferiority expressed by the inner despair of littleness. Quote, grandiosity is always a cover for despair. The ego's default position is for you to believe what about yourself? The ego's default position is for you to believe in your littleness, which brings despair. If your despair, caused by believing in your littleness, becomes so great that you want to find help away from the ego, The ego will respond by doing what? The ego will respond by offering you grandiosity to cover over but not heal your despair caused by your belief in littleness. The ego will encourage you to invest entirely in either one of what two options? The option to invest entirely in grandiosity, or the option to invest entirely in littleness. Or the ego will encourage you to alternate back and forth between grandiosity and littleness as long as you believe what? The ego wants you to alternate between grandiosity and littleness as long as you believe both extremes are real. Outer grandiosity that hides inner despair, quote, is without hope because it is not real. It is an attempt to counteract your littleness based on the belief that the littleness is real. If you could accept that your ego-based belief in littleness is not real, you would give up what? You would give up the false belief in littleness, and you would have no need to counteract littleness with grandiosity. Quote, without this belief in the reality of your littleness, grandiosity is meaningless, and you could not possibly want it. The belief in grandiosity relies on the ego convincing you to do what in relation to others? Grandiosity relies on the ego convincing you to compete with others for superiority. To gain superiority over your brothers, grandiosity always involves what? Grandiosity always involves an attack on your equality with your brothers, who are perceived as your competitors for superiority and specialness. Quote, the essence of grandiosity is competitiveness because it always involves attack. It is a delusional attempt to outdo, but not to undo. The competitive nature of grandiosity brings out the ego's natural range of expressing what two attitudes? The ego's range of expressions is either suspiciousness or viciousness. Quote, we said before that the ego vacillates between suspiciousness and viciousness. The ego expresses suspiciousness when what happens? The ego expresses suspiciousness when your attempts at the superiority of grandiosity fail, and you are left with the inner feelings of despair regarding your littleness and inferiority, which seem real to you. The ego, quote, remains suspicious as long as you despair of yourself. How could you potentially seek relief from the despair of self-condemnation and inferiority? Potentially, you could seek relief by accepting your true inherent equality with all your brothers, whom you recognize as equal parts of the Sonship. When you seek relief from self-condemnation, the ego shifts to what attitude? The ego shifts from its previous suspiciousness to viciousness. The ego's viciousness encourages you to believe your brothers are what? To believe that your brothers are the cause of your self-condemnation because your brothers have expressed superiority over you by perceiving you as being less special than they are. To help you overcome self-condemnation, the ego encourages you to do what? Expressing its viciousness, the ego encourages you to attack your brothers to gain superiority over them, and thus, through self-inflation and grandiosity, overcome the despair of your previous self-condemnation. The ego, quote, shifts to viciousness when you decide not to tolerate self-abasement and seek relief. Then it offers you the illusion of attack as a solution. Paragraph 3. Miracle impulses are what? Miracle impulses are divinely inspired impulses that encourage you to express love and therefore perform miracles. You will need help from the Holy Spirit to recognize miracle impulses. Because of what reason? Because your ego will distort your perception of miracle impulses. Quote, your distorted perceptions produce a dense cover over miracle impulses, making it hard for them to reach your awareness. The ego misinterprets miracle impulses by perceiving them as being what? Your ego misperceives miracle impulses, so they appear to you as being ego-based physical impulses and desires, such as sexual impulses. Quote, the confusion of miracle impulses with physical impulses is a major perceptual distortion. Physical impulses are misdirected miracle impulses. All real pleasure comes from doing God's will, which is always the will of His love. Jesus of 2,000 years ago is an example of a historical figure who welcomed miracle impulses into his awareness because he did what? Because Jesus did not allow the ego to distort his perception, and so he did not mistakenly interpret miracle impulses as physical impulses such as sexual impulses. Unlike Jesus, Samson is an example of a historical figure who allowed his ego to distort his perception. In what way? Samson allowed his ego to cause a, quote, confusion of miracle impulses with physical impulses. Samson did not realize his sexual impulses were misguided miracle impulses, and this was his downfall. What is the lesson that can be learned from the example of Samson? The lesson to learn is to monitor any sexual impulses that you may have and to repeatedly ask for guidance from the Holy Spirit to ensure that your perception is not distorted by the ego seeking to suppress miracle impulses so they appear to you as being physical impulses. When you experience some degree of your God-given grandeur, you may also experience what? You may also experience miracle impulses, but the ego will distort your perception of them. Quote, The ego does not understand the difference between grandeur and grandiosity because it sees no difference between miracle impulses and ego-alien beliefs of its own. According to the previous quotation, grandeur can be associated with miracle impulses because of what reason? Because the awareness of grandeur and the awareness of miracle impulses both come from your higher mind connected to the awareness of God and the attraction to God. Also, the previous quotation implies that grandiosity is an ego-alien belief, but why is this true? Grandiosity is an ego-alien belief because the ego actually truly believes in littleness, but the ego offers you grandiosity only as a temporary counterbalance to the despair caused by your belief in the reality of your littleness. The term ego-alien beliefs refers to what? Refers to what is called ego-dystonic beliefs, which are thoughts that contradict the ego's self-image. Both ego impulses and ego-alien beliefs contradict the ego's self-image, and so the ego views them both in what way? The ego views both miracle impulses and ego-alien beliefs as threats, and therefore treats them the same way by attempting to repress them. An example of miracle impulses is what? An example of miracle impulses is thoughts of God that attempt to come into the awareness of the mind and are viewed by the ego to be threats to the ego itself. Quote, thoughts of God are unacceptable to the ego because they clearly point to the non-existence of the ego itself. The ego, therefore, either distorts them or refuses to accept them. It cannot, however, make them cease to be. An example of ego-alien beliefs is what? An example of ego-alien beliefs is unacceptable body impulses, such as sexual impulses, which the ego cannot control and which contradict the ego's self-image. Just as miracle impulses, such as thoughts of God, are threats to the ego and must be repressed, the ego also represses what? The ego also represses threatening body impulses. The ego, quote, therefore tries to conceal not only unacceptable body impulses, but also the thoughts of God, because both are threatening to it, and being concerned primarily with its own preservation in the face of threat, the ego perceives them as the same. The ego makes no distinctions between what two kinds of threats to itself. The ego makes no distinctions between the threats of miracle impulses, such as the thoughts of God, and ego-alien beliefs, such as unacceptable body impulses. Quote, I told you that the ego is aware of threat to its existence, but makes no distinctions between these two very different kinds of threat. Where can you find correct judgment? You can always turn to the Holy Spirit for correct judgment, because that is his function. What kind of judgment does the ego always offer? Because the ego always feels threatened, the ego is incapable of judgment other than the misguided judgment to attack. The ego's, quote, profound sense of vulnerability renders it incapable of judgment except in terms of attack. The ego's response to threat is always attack, which can be what two kinds of attack? Immediate attack or delayed attack. Quote, when the ego experiences threat, its only decision is whether to attack now or to withdraw to attack later. Because grandiosity is ego-based self-inflation, grandiosity always involves what? Because grandiosity is ego-based self-inflation, grandiosity, quote, always involves attack in the delusional attempt to gain the superiority of specialness over others who are perceived as being worthy of attack because they are less special. If you listen to the ego's desire to attack, what will determine whether you attack immediately or delay your attack? The ego offers you grandiosity when it wants to attack. If you accept its offer, you will attack immediately. If you would rather invest in littleness and not immediately accept the ego's offer of grandiosity, the ego will wait for an opportunity to attack later. Quote, if you accept the ego's offer of grandiosity, it will attack immediately. If you do not, it will wait. Paragraph 4. The presence of God's grandeur reminds you of your reality in God, and so releases you from what? Releases you from the unreality of the ego, which imprisons your mind with the illusory belief in your littleness. Quote, the ego is immobilized in the presence of God's grandeur because his grandeur establishes your freedom. The grandeur of God that you possess expresses the unlimited power and glory of God. But do you have to be fully aware of your grandeur for you to want to release your investment in the ego? No, it takes only a very slight awareness of the reality of this unlimited aspect of God within you in order for you to want to give up your belief in the reality of the ego. Quote, even the faintest hint of your reality literally drives the ego from your mind because you will give up all investment in it. Because grandeur is real, grandeur frees your mind from what? The ego, being an illusion itself, offers you only deceptive illusions to deceive you into believing illusions are reality. But grandeur frees your mind from the belief in ego-based illusions because grandeur brings the awareness of reality. Quote, grandeur is totally without illusions, and because it is real, it is compellingly convincing. If you do accept your grandeur to some degree, what can reduce your conviction regarding the reality of grandeur? The ego will attempt to attack the convincing reality of grandeur. If you allow the ego to attack, the ego's attack will succeed in reducing your conviction about the reality of grandeur and will invite the belief in illusions into your mind. Quote, yet the conviction of reality will not remain with you unless you do not allow the ego to attack it. The ego will try to convince you that the ego is what? The ego will try to convince you that the ego is real, even though it is not real. Quote, the ego will make every effort to recover and mobilize its energies against your release from the littleness of the ego. The foundation of the ego's self-image is the ego's default belief in what? The ego's false belief in your littleness. The ego will tell you that if you believe you possess the grandeur of the power and glory of God, you are little, and so you must be what? The ego will tell you that you are little and must be insane if you believe you possess the power and glory of God. The ego, quote, will tell you that you are insane and argue that grandeur cannot be a real part of you because of the littleness in which it believes. Grandeur is real and not delusional because of what reason? Because God gave you His grandeur, and you did not make your grandeur. Quote, yet your grandeur is not delusional because you did not make it. Why does grandiosity frighten you? The inflation of your ego has manufactured the belief in grandiosity. However, grandiosity relies on competition and the attack of your brothers, which frightens you because your attack brings the fear of being attacked as a response to your attack. Quote, you made grandiosity and are afraid of it because it is a form of attack. Although you are afraid of grandiosity, why are you not afraid of grandeur? You are not afraid of grandeur because it is God's gift of His love to you. Quote, your grandeur is of God, who created it out of His love. Paragraph 5. You can give blessings because what has happened first? You can give blessings because you have received and accepted that you have been blessed first. Quote, you can learn to bless and cannot give what you have not. If, then, you offer blessing, it must have come first to yourself. When you become aware that you have been blessed by the abundance of grandeur as God's gift to you, you are inspired to do what? You are inspired to bless others from the abundance of blessings you have received from God. Quote, from your grandeur, you can only bless because your grandeur is your abundance. Regarding your being blessed by the awareness of grandeur, you must have accepted what? You must have accepted this blessing of grandeur is yours. After having accepted that grandeur is yours, you can give it away as a blessing. Quote, and you must also have accepted this blessing as yours, for how else could you give it away? When you give a blessing away, what really happens? What you give away in the form of a blessing is not really given away because everything, including every blessing, extended from any mind, remains in the mind that extends it. Quote, by blessing, you hold it in your mind, protecting it from illusions and keeping yourself in the mind of God. Where do you remain? Because you are a thought of light and love within the mind of God, you always remain in God's mind, regardless of your illusory dreams of separation from God. Quote, remember always that you cannot be anywhere except in the mind of God. If you forget that you are forever a thought in the mind of God, what will be the result? If you forget that you are forever a thought in the mind of God, you will forget your grandeur, and you will invest in the illusion of littleness of the ego, which leads to despair and to seeking to inflate the ego with grandiosity that always involves attacking your brothers to acquire the illusion of specialness. Quote, when you forget this awareness of being forever a thought within the mind of God, you will despair and you will attack. It is important to remember that you are a thought within the mind of God because of what reason? Because, quote, you will believe that you are part of where you think you are. It is very helpful for you to believe that you are part of the mind of God because of what reason? Because the awareness that you are part of the mind of God will help you to let go of identifying with the false self-image of the ego and will help you to identify with your true nature as God created you. When you remember that you are a thought in the mind of God, you will remember what about yourself? You will remember your divine qualities that are your God-given inheritance and that are part of your grandeur received from God. Quote, everyone is free to refuse to accept his inheritance, but he is not free to establish what his inheritance is. When you accept your divine inheritance, one example of what you will remember is what? One example of what you will remember is your God-given attribute of holiness. Workbook Lesson 35 affirms, quote, my mind is part of God's. I am very holy. Another example of a divine quality you will accept and remember is the peace of God that is within you. Quote, peace is a natural heritage of spirit. Now, in this world, what is your only purpose? Your only purpose is to remember that when God created you as a thought within his mind, he gave you all of himself, and so you have been given all of his divine qualities, with the one exception being that you cannot be the first cause because you are the effect of your Creator. Quote, God gave you and your brother himself, and to remember this is now the only purpose that you share, and so it is the only one you have. That's the end of the questions and answers portion of this podcast. Now I ask you to join me in a 1-minute meditation. For this meditation, I ask you to focus on the acceptance of your grandeur. You possess the grandeur of God because you are a part of God. When you accept your grandeur, at the same time, you are accepting all of the divine attributes God has given you, such as His light, His love, His truth, and His holiness, among many other divine attributes. By accepting your grandeur, you won't be tempted by the ego to believe in grandiosity, and you won't be tempted by the ego to believe in littleness. The acceptance of grandeur helps you to identify with your true self, with the Christ, with being the Holy Son of God, and identify with your true shared self. Also, accepting your grandeur helps you to let go of identifying with your false, ego-based self-image of littleness, or your false, ego-based self-image of grandiosity. Normally, in our daily lives, we don't think about the grandeur that we possess by being part of God, but that's why we're having this 1-minute meditation, to focus on this idea that because we're part of God, we possess His grandeur, meaning we possess all of His divine attributes. This is God's inheritance to us, and we won't fully receive this inheritance until we wake up in heaven. But right now, with our perception, we can open our mind, open our awareness to the acceptance of our true grandeur that we receive from God and is awaiting our full awareness in heaven. I'm going to set the timer for 1 minute. When the timer goes off, that will be the end of the meditation and the end of this podcast. Here we go together, focusing on the acceptance of your God-given grandeur. Amen.